The conference room at 20th Century Fox, Los Angeles, 1959. 10 men in dark suits sat around a mahogany table cluttered with script pages and coffee cups that had gone cold an hour ago. Marilyn Monroe was the only woman in the room, and she'd been sitting there for 20 minutes listening to them argue about her character's motivation, as if she wasn't present. The producer at the head of the table, a man named Harold Weinstein who'd greenlit 3 of the studio's biggest hits that decade, kept glancing at his watch. He'd already made it clear this meeting was a courtesy, not a collaboration. What I'm going to tell you today might change how you see one of Hollywood's most famous figures. Before we continue, subscribe so you won't miss the stories that never made it into the official biographies, the moments that happened behind closed doors, when the cameras were off and the real person showed through. Weinstein tapped his pen against the table, a rhythmic sound that seemed designed to fill silence with impatience. "Look," he said, not addressing Marilyn directly but speaking about her to the director seated 2 chairs down. "We need to simplify the dialogue in scene 12. Make it more accessible." He paused, then added with what might have been intended as humor, "We're not making Chekhov here." A few men chuckled, the kind of laughter that comes easy when someone with power makes a joke, regardless of whether it's funny. Marilyn had her hands folded in her lap, a small leather notebook resting beneath them. She'd filled it with notes over the past 3 weeks, questions about her character's history, observations about the script's structure, references to books she'd been reading to understand the period. She hadn't opened it yet. The director, a younger man named Paul Drucker who'd worked with her once before, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The silence that followed Weinstein's comment stretched just long enough to become awkward. "Actually," Marilyn said quietly, her voice carrying across the table without rising in volume, "I think the dialogue in that scene is one of the strongest in the script." She didn't elaborate immediately. She let the statement sit there, simple and clear. Weinstein's pen stopped tapping. He looked at her directly for the first time since the meeting began, his expression somewhere between surprise and annoyance that she'd spoken up at all. The room's energy shifted subtly, like air pressure changing before a storm. Weinstein leaned back in his chair, a gesture that communicated ease, but felt calculated. "Well," he said, and his tone had changed, become more pointed. "I appreciate your input, Marilyn, but we're talking about pacing here, commercial appeal, things that require a certain understanding of how audiences think." He paused, and what came next was delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Not everyone grew up reading scripts in boarding school, you know. Some of us had to learn this business the hard way." The men around the table went very still. It wasn't what he'd said. The words themselves could have been innocent enough. It was the way he'd said it, the emphasis on boarding school, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Everyone in that room knew Marilyn's history, the foster homes, the childhood spent being moved from place to place, the years of instability that had been written about in every magazine profile, dissected in every interview. Weinstein had just used it as punctuation in a business disagreement. One of the writers, a man in his 40s named Robert Chen, looked down at his notepad suddenly, as if something there had become urgently interesting. The script supervisor, a woman named Dorothy who'd been scribbling notes throughout the meeting, stopped writing mid-sentence. Paul Drucker opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence in the room was no longer awkward. It was uncomfortable in a different way, the kind of discomfort that comes when someone says something they can't take back and everyone knows it. Marilyn didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change at all, which somehow made the moment more powerful than any visible reaction would have been. She looked at Weinstein steadily, not with anger or hurt, but with something that resembled curiosity, as if she were studying him, trying to understand what kind of man uses someone's childhood as a weapon in a script meeting. She took a slow breath, the kind of breath someone takes when they're choosing their words carefully, when they know that what they say next matters. "You're right," she said finally, her voice still quiet, still controlled. "I didn't go to boarding school." She paused, let that acknowledgement hang there for a moment. "I spent my childhood in 11 different homes. I remember every single one. I remember the people who took me in because they needed the county check. I remember the ones who were kind but couldn't keep me. I remember learning very early that the world doesn't owe you anything, and that if you want to understand something, You have to work twice as hard as everyone else." She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused him of anything, but the words landed with the weight of truth, and suddenly the power dynamic in the room had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with who signed the checks or approved the budgets. Weinstein's face had gone slightly red, though whether from embarrassment or anger wasn't clear. He started to say something, stopped, then tried again. "I didn't mean," he began, but Marilyn continued as if he hadn't spoken. "So when I read this script," she went on, tapping the pages in front of her lightly with one finger, "I read it carefully. I read it multiple times. I looked up words I didn't know. I researched the period. I made notes about character consistency and thematic resonance, not because anyone asked me to, but because that's what the work requires." She paused again, and this time the pause felt deliberate, purposeful. "I may not have your educational background, Mr. Weinstein, but I understand how to read, and I understand this character." The room had gone completely silent now. No one was looking at their notes anymore. No one was pretending to be occupied with anything other than what was happening. Robert Chen had set his pen down entirely. Dorothy was watching Marilyn with an expression that might have been respect or might have been surprise, possibly both. Paul Drucker was leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table in front of him, his earlier discomfort replaced by something that looked like attention, real attention. Weinstein's jaw had tightened. He was a man used to controlling rooms, used to having the final word, used to people deferring to him not because he was right but because he had the authority to make decisions stick. This was not deference. This was something else entirely. "Look," he said, and his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I'm just trying to make sure we have a film that works. That's my job. And playing this character is mine," Marilyn replied. Her voice was still even, still calm, but there was steel underneath it now, quiet but unmistakable. "Scene 12 works because the dialogue reveals something about who she is. If we simplify it the way you're suggesting, we lose that revelation. We lose the moment where the audience understands she's not who they thought she was." She paused, then added, "Isn't that what good storytelling does? It surprises people. It challenges their assumptions." The last sentence hung in the air with particular weight, because everyone in that room understood it wasn't just about the character anymore. It was about assumptions in general, about the assumptions that had been made about Marilyn herself, about what she was capable of understanding, about whether her opinion on her own character was worth considering. Weinstein looked like he wanted to argue, but he seemed to realize that anything he said now would only make things worse. Paul Drucker cleared his throat. "I think," he said carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation, "that Marilyn makes a good point. The dialogue in Scene 12 does serve a specific purpose. Maybe we should consider keeping it as written and addressing pacing in other ways." He looked at Weinstein when he said it, not challenging exactly, but not deferring either, just stating a professional opinion, the way someone might when they've been given permission by someone else's courage. Robert Chen nodded slowly. "I agree," he said. "The scene plays differently if we cut that dialogue. Not better, just different. And I think we'd lose something." Other heads around the table started nodding, a quiet consensus forming that had nothing to do with Weinstein's authority and everything to do with the actual merit of the discussion. The producer looked around the room, reading the shift, understanding that he'd lost this particular battle not through argument but through atmosphere. "Fine," Weinstein said finally, his voice clipped. "We'll table this discussion for now and revisit it during rehearsals." It was a retreat disguised as a postponement, and everyone knew it. He started gathering his papers, signaling that the meeting was effectively over, even though there were still items on the agenda that hadn't been addressed. "I have another meeting," he said, which may or may not have been true. "Paul, send me your notes by Thursday." People began standing, collecting scripts and notebooks, moving toward the door with the kind of quick efficiency that suggests relief that something difficult is over. But the energy in the room had fundamentally changed. Dorothy approached Marilyn as she was putting her own notebook in her bag. "That was well said," she told her quietly, a brief comment that wouldn't be overheard but was clearly sincere. Marilyn smiled slightly, a small acknowledgement, and nodded. Robert Chen stopped by her chair on his way out. "I'd actually like to hear more of your thoughts on the script sometime," he said, "if you're willing to talk through it." He said it casually, but there was genuine interest in his voice. The kind of interest that comes from realizing someone has insight you hadn't anticipated. Marilyn told him she'd be happy to, and he left looking thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. Paul Drucker waited until most of the others had filed out before approaching her. "I should have said something earlier," he told her quietly. "When he made that comment, I should have said something." Marilyn looked at him for a moment, reading the genuine regret in his expression. "You're saying something now," she replied, "by agreeing with me in front of everyone. That mattered." He nodded, seemed to want to say more, but settled for, "Thank you," and left. Weinstein was the last to leave, and he paused at the door. For a moment it seemed like he might say something, apologize perhaps, or try to smooth things over. But he looked at Marilyn, saw whatever expression was on her face, and seemed to decide against it. He left without a word, closing the door behind him with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Marilyn stood there alone in the conference room for a moment, surrounded by empty chairs and forgotten coffee cups. She picked up her notebook, felt the weight of it in her hands. All those notes, all those hours of preparation that no one had asked her to do. She'd done it anyway, because that was how she'd learned to survive. By working harder, by being more prepared, by never giving anyone a legitimate reason to dismiss her, even though they often did anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with preparation or competence, and everything to do with assumptions they'd made before she ever walked into a room. The meeting had lasted 45 minutes. In that time, something had shifted that couldn't be easily measured or quantified. It wasn't that Weinstein had suddenly developed respect for her. Men like him rarely changed their fundamental opinions based on a single conversation. But he'd learned something about the cost of expressing those opinions publicly, about what happened when you tried to use someone's pain as a punchline, and they refused to be diminished by it. The story of what happened in that conference room spread through the studio in the way these things do. Not officially, not in memos or meetings, but in quiet conversations between people who'd been there or heard about it from someone who had. The details got slightly distorted in the telling, as details always do, but the essential truth remained. Marilyn Monroe had been underestimated, had been dismissed, and had responded not with tears or anger, but with a dignity that made the dismissal itself look small and cruel. Paul Drucker made sure Scene 12 stayed exactly as written. When they filmed it 3 weeks later, he gave Marilyn the space to play it the way she'd envisioned, and when the rushes came back, even the studio executives who'd been skeptical had to admit it worked. The scene became one of the most praised moments in the film, the moment where audiences realized the character was deeper than they'd assumed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. These moments happened more often than most people realize. Times when Marilyn had to prove herself in rooms full of men who'd already decided who she was. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. There are others that deserve to be told. Weinstein never publicly apologized for what he'd said, but he also never tried to change the script again. In subsequent meetings about the film, he addressed Marilyn directly when discussing her character, asked for her input, treated her as a collaborator rather than a problem to be managed. It wasn't warmth, that would have been too much to expect, but it was professional respect, which in its own way was an acknowledgement that he'd misjudged her. Dorothy, the script supervisor, started bringing scene notes directly to Marilyn during production, asking for her thoughts on continuity and character motivation. Robert Chen invited her to a small dinner party at his home 3 months later, where he introduced her to his wife as one of the most thoughtful actors I've worked with. These were small gestures, but they mattered because they represented a shift in how she was seen by people whose opinions carried weight in the industry. The film was released in the spring of 1960 to strong reviews. Critics mentioned Marilyn's performance specifically, noting a depth and intelligence that defied her established screen persona. One reviewer wrote that she brought unexpected gravitas to a role that could have been merely decorative. Another observed that she commanded scenes not through obvious theatrics, but through stillness and precision. These weren't the kind of reviews she usually received, and they meant something to her, though she rarely spoke about it publicly. Years later, after Marilyn's death, Paul Drucker was interviewed for a documentary about her life and career. He talked about that meeting, about Weinstein's comment and Marilyn's response. "She taught me something that day," he said on camera. "She taught me that dignity isn't something people can take from you. It's something you maintain, regardless of how you're treated." I've tried to remember that in my own work, in how I treat actors. I don't always succeed, but I remember. Robert Chen wrote about the incident years later in his memoir, though he didn't name Weinstein directly. He described it as the moment I realized that intelligence takes many forms, and education is only one of them. She'd educated herself in ways that mattered to the work, and she'd done it without anyone holding her hand or giving her credit. That's a different kind of strength than I'd been taught to recognize, but it's no less valuable. He dedicated the chapter to her memory. What happened in that conference room didn't change Hollywood. It didn't spark a movement or lead to widespread reform in how women were treated in the industry. Those kinds of systemic changes would take decades and would come from different places, different people, different battles. But it changed something in that specific space, for those specific people, and that mattered too. Change doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and declarations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the moment when someone refuses to accept the role they've been assigned. Marilyn continued to prepare extensively for her roles, continued to fill notebooks with observations and questions, continued to work harder than anyone expected or acknowledged. She continued to be underestimated, continued to face men who thought her beauty and her public image were the full measure of who she was. Some learned otherwise. Some never did. But she kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept insisting on being taken seriously even when it would have been easier to just accept the limitations others tried to place on her. The conference room at 20th Century Fox was repainted in 1961, the mahogany table replaced with something more modern. New meetings happened there, new conflicts, new negotiations. The physical space moved on, as physical spaces do. But the people who were in that room in 1959 carried something away with them. A memory of a moment when someone with less power than everyone else in the room had somehow controlled it completely, not through force or manipulation, but through the simple refusal to be diminished. That's what dignity looks like when it's real. Not performance, not pretense, but the quiet insistence that your humanity deserves acknowledgement regardless of your past, your education, or the assumptions others make about you. Marilyn understood that instinctively, had learned it through years of being underestimated and dismissed. She'd learned that you can't always change how people see you, but you can always control how you respond to being misunderstood. The meeting ended. People left. Work continued. But something had been established that couldn't be easily undone. The understanding that Marilyn Monroe was more than the image, more than the publicity, more than the assumptions. She was someone who read carefully and thought deeply, and refused to pretend otherwise just to make others comfortable. In a town built on images and illusions, that kind of honesty was almost radical. The stories that never made the headlines often tell us more about who someone really was than the ones that did. If you want to hear more of these quiet moments of strength, subscribe. They're worth remembering. Years pass. Memories fade. The people in that room grew older, moved on to other projects, other conflicts, other rooms where power was negotiated and dignity defended. But when they remembered Marilyn Monroe, not the icon, not the image, but the actual person they'd worked with, some of them remembered that meeting. They remembered her voice, quiet and controlled. They remembered her refusing to be small. They remembered learning something they hadn't expected to learn that day. And in their own ways, some of them tried to do better because of it.